Look at this machine and try to guess when it was built. The boiler runs almost the full length of the frame, long and low and close to the rails. Pipework follows its flanks in neat parallel lines. The driving wheel stands taller than the men beside it. Everything about the shape suggests speed, and everything about the proportions suggests an engineer who already knew exactly what he was doing. If you were shown this picture without a caption, you might guess 1930. You might guess 1920 if you were being careful. The caption says 1844. 1844 is 4 years before the California Gold Rush. It is 25 years before the American Transcontinental Railroad. It is a year in which most people alive had never travelled faster than a horse could run, and in which the majority of Britain's railway network had not been built yet. So one of two things has to be true. Either railway engineering in the 1840s was far more advanced than most of us were ever taught, or the caption is wrong. That is the question this film is going to answer. Not by arguing about what feels plausible, but by treating the picture the way an investigator would treat any other piece of evidence, what is actually visible in it, when each of those features first entered the historical record, and whether the photographic technology available in 1844 could have produced an image like this at all. There is a complication, and it arrives immediately. There is not one 1844 train. Go looking for it and you will find several. A long, low express engine with an enormous wheel set behind the firebox. A towering machine with a single driving wheel taller than a grown man. A dark, heavy locomotive standing under a station roof that looks far too grand for the decade. All of them carry the same year. None of them show the same machine. That is the first real clue, and it is worth sitting with. A date attached to one object is a claim you can test. You go to the archive, you find the object, you check the paperwork. A date floating between 4 different objects is a different kind of thing entirely. It is not a record. It is a label that has come loose. So we are going to work in order. First, we establish what a locomotive genuinely looked like in 1844, using records rather than memory. Then we examine the specific features that make these images feel impossible, and find out when those features actually appear. Then we look at the photographs themselves, because photography has its own timeline, and that timeline is unforgiving. And finally, we trace the year, and try to work out what it was originally attached to. The answer is stranger than the myth, and it is better documented. Because the surprising part of this story is not that the machines look advanced. It is that some of them genuinely were. Start with what is not in dispute. In 1844, the railway was 19 years old. The Stockton and Darlington had opened in September of 1825. The Rainhill trials, where Stephenson's rocket established the basic pattern that steam locomotives would follow for the next 130 years, had taken place in 1829. That pattern is worth understanding, because everything that follows is a variation on it. A firebox at the back, a boiler full of tubes running forward from that firebox, a smoke box and a chimney at the front. Exhaust steam directed up the chimney to pull the fire hotter. Once those elements were in place, the argument in locomotive design was no longer about principle. It was about proportion. And by the early 1840s, that argument had produced machines that were already large. On the Great Western Railway, Daniel Gooch had been appointed locomotive superintendent in 1837 at the age of 21. Between 1840 and 1842, his Firefly class went into service. 62 of them were built by 7 different manufacturers, and every one of them carried a single pair of driving wheels 7 feet across, running on Brunel's broad gauge of 7 feet and a quarter inch. 7-foot driving wheels in 1840. Look at a Firefly, and you will see something that reads as unmistakably early. There is no cab. The driver and fireman stand on an open platform behind the boiler, exposed to the weather at whatever speed the engine is making. The wheels are wooden-centered with iron tires. The frames are timber, sandwiched between iron plates. The chimney is a plain, tapered stack. There are no brakes on the engine worth the name. Stopping is a matter of shutting off steam, reversing and hoping the guard is doing his part. And yet, on the 1st of May, 1844, the line to Exeter opened. Gooch himself climbed onto the footplate of a Firefly-class engine named Action and took the 7:30 out of Paddington. He reached Exeter, 194 miles away, at 12:30. Accounts of that run disagree on the details. One puts the running time at 4 hours and 40 minutes and the average at about 41 miles an hour. Another gives a 5-hour journey and an average of around 45 on the return leg that evening. The disagreement is real and it is not resolvable from here, but the range is what matters. In 1844, on the day the line opened, a British express train averaged somewhere in the region of 40 miles an hour across nearly 200 miles of track. That is the baseline. Not primitive, not crude. Fast, open, wooden-framed and unmistakably of its decade. Now put the disputed image next to it. The differences are not subtle. The disputed machine has iron frames, not timber. It has a boiler that sits low and runs long, where the Firefly's sits high and short. It has cylinders mounted outside the frames at the middle of the engine, where the Firefly's are tucked inside at the front. Several versions show a cab, an enclosed shelter with a roof and side sheets, which the Firefly does not have, and which almost no British locomotive had in 1844. None of that proves a date on its own. Engineering does not move in a single line, and unusual machines exist in every decade. One component can always be explained away. But this is where the investigation actually begins, because these features are not random. Each one entered the record at a traceable moment, and when you check them one at a time, they do not scatter across the century. They cluster. Take the most conspicuous feature first, the driving wheel placed behind the firebox. On a conventional locomotive of the 1840s, the driving axle sits under the boiler. That creates a hard limit. Make the wheel bigger and you raise the axle. Raise the axle and you raise the boiler with it. Raise the boiler and the engine becomes top-heavy on track that was, at the time, light and imperfectly laid. A young engineer named Thomas Russell Crampton found a way around it. Crampton had trained under Mark Brunel and then worked under Gooch at the Great Western, where he prepared drawings for the company's locomotives. He understood the broad gauge argument from the inside, that big wheels were the route to speed, and he wanted to apply it on standard gauge track. His solution was to move the driving axle out from under the boiler entirely and set it behind the firebox at the very rear of the engine. Once the axle was clear of the boiler, the wheel could be made almost any size you liked, while the boiler itself dropped down close to the frames. The result is a machine with an extremely low center of gravity, a very long boiler, cylinders exposed on the outside where a fitter could reach them, and one enormous wheel at the back. It is the silhouette that makes people think of the 20th century. Long, low, stretched, mechanical, with the working parts on display rather than buried. Crampton patented it in 1843. Not 1844. 1843. British patent number 10,312. And a patent is a piece of paper, not a machine. He then spent 2 years failing to sell it. No British railway wanted to be first. In 1844, the year in question, Crampton was working for the engineering firm of John and George Rennie and building nothing at all under his own name. His first order came in 1845 from the British managers of the Namur and Liège Railway in Belgium. 3 engines, 7-foot driving wheels, built by the firm of Tulk and Ley at Whitehaven. The records disagree slightly on when they were finished. Some give 1846, some 1847. So the first Crampton locomotive in the world ran 2 or 3 years after 1844. There is no version of the record in which one exists earlier. That is one feature accounted for. One component does not establish a date, but the same exercise, run across the rest of the machine, keeps producing years on the far side of 1844. The 8-foot driving wheel is the clearest example. 7 feet was the ceiling in 1844. Gucci's Fireflies had 7-foot wheels, and they were the largest in regular express service in Britain. 8 feet did not arrive until 1847, when the Great Western's Iron Duke class entered service at Swindon with 8-foot drivers and enough boiler behind them to use it. In May of 1848, one of them, Great Britain, was recorded at 78.2 miles an hour near Wootton Bassett. 78 miles an hour, 1848, on wooden-centered wheels with no continuous brakes and no cab. That is not a machine ahead of its time. That is a machine at the absolute limit of its time, which is a more interesting thing to be. Then there is the tender and the carriages behind it and the station around it. Passenger stock in 1844 was still recognizably descended from the stagecoach. Short four-wheeled bodies, compartment doors, and third-class accommodation that had only just stopped being open to the sky. The Regulation of Railways Act of that year required companies to run cheap third-class services in covered carriages. That requirement exists because before 1844, third-class passengers rode in the open. If a picture dated 1844 shows long bogie carriages or a glazed train shed with iron arches spanning multiple platforms, those elements are not from 1844 either. 5 features, and every one of them lands after the caption. That is no longer a coincidence. That is a pattern. But there is a stronger test available, and it does not depend on locomotive history at all. It depends on chemistry. Photography in 1844 was 5 years old. Louis Daguerre's process had been released to the world in 1839, and William Henry Fox Talbot had patented the calotype, the paper negative, in 1841. Those were the 2 options. There were no others. Both were slow. A daguerreotype produced a sharp image on a silvered copper plate, but only one, with no negative and no copies, and exposures were measured in minutes rather than seconds. The calotype could be reproduced, but the image came through the texture of the paper itself, which left it softer and grainier. Neither process could stop a moving human being. That single fact does more work than any amount of argument about rivets. In 1844, anyone who moved during the exposure either blurred into a smear or vanished from the plate altogether. A figure standing beside a locomotive with sharply defined hands, a readable face, and crisp folds in his coat was not photographed in 1844. The chemistry could not hold him. The situation changed in March of 1851 when a London sculptor named Frederick Scott Archer published the wet collodion process. Glass plates, coated and exposed while still wet, combining the sharpness of the daguerreotype with the reproducibility of the calotype, and critically, exposures measured in seconds rather than minutes. Archer never patented it. He gave it away, and it spread across the world within a decade. Every crisp, deep, tonally rich 19th century railway photograph you have ever seen sits on the far side of that date. And the photographing of locomotives specifically took longer still. The earliest railway photographs do exist in the 1840s. An image of Linlithgow Station made by David Octavius Hill and Robert Adamson in 1845 is among the earliest known, but they are stations and views, not engineering records. The systematic photography of locomotives, engines posed in works yards to be documented, begins in the mid-1850s. Bayer Peacock of Manchester started the practice in about 1856, employing a local photographer named James Mudd. Railway companies even repainted engines to be photographed. Locomotives were finished in a light grey specifically because early plates rendered dark green and red as an indistinct black mass. A whole livery existed for no purpose except to make a machine legible to a camera. That is what the photographic record of locomotives actually looks like. It starts in the 1850s. It is a manufacturer's record before it is anything else. So we can be precise about what an 1844 photograph of a locomotive would have to look like. Soft. Grainy, or plate-marked, almost certainly empty of people or containing only smears where people stood, probably a station or a structure rather than a posed engine, and extremely rare, because almost nobody was doing it. Set that description against a sharp, detailed image of a large locomotive with clearly rendered bystanders. The two do not overlap at any point, which does not tell us what the image is. It tells us what it is not. There are three possibilities left, and they are quite different from one another. It could be a photograph, a real one, correctly showing a real machine carrying the wrong year. Given how many locomotives were photographed from the 1850s onward, and how easily an accurate picture can pick up an inaccurate caption, this is the ordinary explanation. It requires nothing unusual to have happened. It could be an engraving or a technical drawing that has been mistaken for a photograph. This is more common than people expect. Victorian engineering journals produced extraordinarily detailed engraved side elevations of locomotives, and when those are scanned, converted to grayscale, softened by compression, and passed around at low resolution, they can read as photographic. And drawings have a specific tell. An engraved locomotive is often drawn in a state the finished machine never physically reached, because the drawing is of the design rather than the object. Or it could be recently generated, an image made by a model that has learned what old locomotive photograph looks like without learning what any particular locomotive was. Each leaves different marks, and we will come back to them. Before that, there is something that has to be said plainly, because the whole premise depends on it being wrong. The 1840s were not primitive. It is easy to assume that a machine looking sophisticated is evidence of a later date. Very often it is. But the assumption breaks down badly in this particular decade, because the 1840s produced some of the most extreme locomotives ever built in Britain, and the reason they look strange is not that they were ahead of their time. It is that they were solving a problem we no longer have. Consider what a locomotive engineer was actually up against. He wanted speed. Speed meant a fast-turning wheel rim, but the metallurgy of the day put a hard limit on how fast a piston could safely move and how fast a bearing could turn without failing. The only lever left was wheel diameter. A bigger wheel travels further per revolution, so the engine goes faster while the machinery inside it turns no quicker. That is why the 1840s look the way they do. Every one of those enormous wheels is an engineer working around the limits of the iron he had, and they went further than most people realize. In 1838, 6 years before our disputed date, the Great Western took delivery of a locomotive called Hurricane, designed by Thomas Elliot Harrison and built by Hawthorne of Newcastle. Brunel had written specifications so strict that the manufacturers could not meet them conventionally, so Harrison stopped being conventional. He put the boiler on one 6-wheeled frame and the engine on another, separating them entirely. Then he gave it a single pair of driving wheels 10 feet across. 10 feet. Taller than the men who worked on it, and larger than anything in the disputed images. Its sister engine, Thunderer, went further still and used gearing to multiply wheel speed. Both were failures. Thunderer ran under 10,000 miles and was withdrawn in December of 1839. Hurricane lasted barely longer. Its boiler was recycled into a goods engine, and its magnificent wheels were pulled out of storage years later to carry a 40-ton bronze statue of the Duke of Wellington through the streets of London. The point is not that they worked. The point is that in 1838, a British engineer with a difficult brief built a 10-foot driving wheel, and it was neither secret nor lost. It was documented, it was tried, and it was abandoned because it was not any good. The same thing happened at the top end of the decade, at a much larger scale. In 1848, the London and North Western Railway took delivery of a Crampton-type locomotive from Berry, Curtis and Kennedy of Liverpool. They named it Liverpool. It had 8-foot driving wheels, a boiler containing 300 tubes, a heating surface of some 2,290 square feet, and it weighed 35 tons. Contemporary accounts describe it as the most powerful locomotive in the world. It was also, by the standards of 1848, a disaster. The problem was not the engine, it was the ground. Liverpool had a long, rigid wheelbase and enormous weight, and the permanent way of the 1840s, light rails on stone blocks and timber, could not take it. The locomotive hammered the track apart underneath itself. It was withdrawn around 1852, after roughly 4 years. Then, in 1851, it was placed on display at the Great Exhibition in the Crystal Palace, where it won a gold medal. Read those two facts together, because they are the heart of this story. A machine can be simultaneously the most powerful in the world, the winner of the highest award available, and completely unusable, not because of any flaw in its own design, but because the infrastructure around it had not caught up. That is what ahead of its time actually means. It does not mean forbidden, it does not mean suppressed. It means the rest of the system was the bottleneck. And this is where the most useful machine in the whole story comes in, because it is still here and you can go and look at it. In 1847, at Crewe, Francis Trevithick, son of Richard Trevithick, the man who put the first steam locomotive on rails, built an engine called Cornwall. It had 8-foot 6-inch driving wheels, larger than anything the Great Western ever ran. And to keep the centre of gravity low with wheels that size, Trevithick did something almost nobody else has ever done. He put the boiler underneath the driving axle. Not around it, not beside it, below it, with a channel recessed across the top of the boiler so the axle had somewhere to pass, and a tube driven crosswise through the middle of the firebox to carry the rear axle through. The result looked less like a locomotive than like a locomotive turned inside out. It was shown at the Great Exhibition in 1851 in exactly that form. Cornwall was not a curiosity. It worked. It ran express trains between Liverpool, Manchester, Crewe and London for over half a century, and it was still being clocked at 70 miles an hour down Whitmore Bank in the 1880s, decades after its design should have retired it. It survives today, but here is the part that matters for our investigation, and it is the single most important thing in this film. The Cornwall you can go and see is not the Cornwall of 1847. In 1858 it was completely reconstructed. The strange underslung boiler was removed and replaced with a conventional one mounted where you would expect. In 1871, a cab was added. Its present appearance dates from 1887, when it was given a new boiler and a round smokebox door. The wheels are original. Almost nothing else is. So a photograph of Cornwall, a genuine photograph, of a genuine locomotive in a genuine museum, correctly labelled with its build date of 1847, shows a machine that is largely from 1887. Nobody has lied. Nobody has faked anything. The caption is accurate, and the image is authentic, and they still describe different decades. Multiply that across an entire industry. A design date, a patent date, a build date, a rebuild date, an exhibition date, a photograph date. 6 different years can legitimately attach to one machine, and only one of them is the year the picture was taken. Now we can go looking for 1844 itself. The honest answer is that the origin cannot be traced. There is no identifiable first upload, no original caption, no first poster. The available record does not establish who attached the year or when, and anyone claiming otherwise is guessing. No accusation is being made here. But the mechanism can be described because it is not mysterious. Start with why the year is attractive in the first place. 1844 is a genuinely significant railway year, and it left a lot of documents behind. The South Eastern Railway opened through to Dover in February. The atmospheric railway between Kingstown and Dalkey opened in March, running trains on air pressure rather than locomotives. One of the strangest things the Victorians ever built and operated successfully. The Samuda brothers patented their atmospheric system in April. The line to Exeter opened on the 1st of May. Turner exhibited rain, steam and speed at the Royal Academy 5 days later. The Midland Railway was formed on the 10th. Parliament passed the Regulation of Railways Act. In Berlin, the locomotive Beuth was put on public display. If you were searching the archives for railway material, 1844 would return a great deal. It is a year with gravity. Loose facts drift toward it. Then consider how a caption actually degrades. A picture enters circulation with a full description: the machine, the builder, the railway, the date of the drawing, the date of the design, the date of the photograph. It gets reposted. Someone crops it to fit a layout. Someone shortens the caption to fit a character limit. Someone reads, "Patented 1843, first ordered 1845, and remembers it as a single number somewhere in between. Someone else colorizes it or upscales it, and in doing so strips out whatever file information it was carrying. 10 reposts later, all that remains is an image and a year, and nobody can say which of the 6 possible years it was. That process needs no deception at all. It only needs speed and compression, which is what the internet is made of." There is a newer factor as well. Generated images have been circulating for several years now, trained on genuine archival photographs and reproducing their surface qualities, the scratches, the tonal fall-off, the faded corners, without reproducing any actual machine. These images are frequently very convincing at a glance, and they are frequently very wrong under examination, because the model has learned what an old photograph looks like rather than what a locomotive is. The tells are mechanical rather than aesthetic. Connecting rods that attach to nothing. Wheel spokes that change count between the near and far side. Pipework that enters a boiler and does not emerge. Rivet lines that wander out of true. Lettering that resolves into shapes rather than words when you zoom in. A locomotive is a machine in which every visible part exists to transmit force somewhere. So a picture in which the forces do not connect is not a picture of a working machine. That test is worth carrying out of this film. When you meet an old photograph of any machine, follow the moving parts and check they go somewhere. So, 4 possible explanations. They are not equally supported, and it is worth being direct about which is which. The first is that a genuinely advanced locomotive was built in 1844. In its favour, the engineering knowledge required did exist in outline. Crampton's patent was already filed. Large driving wheels had been attempted 6 years earlier on the Great Western. Against it, no locomotive with any of these features is recorded in 1844 in any manufacturer's list, museum catalogue, patent record or contemporary journal. Locomotive building was an intensely documented and intensely competitive industry, and the machines under discussion would have been the most remarkable objects in Britain. The first Crampton was ordered in 1845 and built in 1846 or 47. 8-foot wheels arrive in 1847, and regardless of what was built, no photographic process existed in 1844 that could have recorded it in this form. This explanation fails on the evidence, and it fails twice over. The second is that the images show real, later locomotives carrying an incorrect date. In its favour, nearly everything. Every advanced feature in the disputed images has a documented arrival date between 1846 and 1852. The photographic technology needed to capture them arrives in 1851. The practice of photographing locomotives becomes routine from the mid-50s. Machines matching these descriptions demonstrably existed and were photographed. Liverpool, Cornwall, the Iron Dukes, the Cramptons of the 1850s, and the mechanism by which the wrong year attaches is not only plausible but visible in ordinary museum practice, where build dates and photograph dates routinely differ by decades. Against it, only that the origin of the specific number cannot be traced. That is a gap in the record, not a point in favour of anything else. This explanation fits more evidence than the other 3 combined. The third is that an engraving or technical drawing has been mistaken for a photograph. In its favour, Victorian engineering illustration was extraordinarily detailed and reproduction degrades it toward a photographic look. Some of the most reproduced images of early locomotives, including Cornwall in its original underslung form, exist principally as drawings, because the machines were rebuilt before locomotive photography became common. A drawing is also more likely to carry a design or patent year than a photograph is. Against it, it cannot account for images containing photographic artifacts, plate damage, chemical staining, motion blur, that engraving does not produce. This is a strong, partial explanation. It probably accounts for some of the circulating images and not others. The fourth is that some images are recently generated or heavily altered. In its favor, generated historical imagery is now common, the artifacts are documented, and some circulating examples do contain mechanically impossible arrangements. Against it, it cannot be the whole answer, because the claim predates the technology, and because genuine photographs of genuinely astonishing locomotives are sitting in public museum collections right now. Some of these images are real. Assuming they are all fake makes exactly the same mistake as assuming they are all authentic, accepting a label without checking the object. The evidence points hardest at the second explanation, supported in part by the third, with the fourth accounting for a growing share of what is circulating now. So let us go back to where we started. The image is extraordinary. It is not extraordinary for the reason the caption suggests. The surviving evidence indicates that the machines in these pictures are real locomotives built between 1846 and the early 1850s, photographed after the wet collodion process made such photographs possible in 1851, and carrying a year that belongs to something else, to a patent filed in 1843, to a famous railway year that attracts loose facts, or to nothing more than a caption that lost its context somewhere on the way. 1844 itself was a real and busy year on the railways. Gooch drove a Firefly to Exeter at 40 miles an hour. Trains ran on compressed air outside Dublin. Turner exhibited a painting of a locomotive crossing a bridge in the rain, and it was the most modern subject any serious painter had chosen that year. But no machine like the one in the picture existed in it, and no camera in it could have taken the picture. And the correction does not make early railway history smaller, it makes it sharper. Because what these images are actually documenting is a window of about 6 years, in which British engineers built the largest driving wheels ever fitted to a working express locomotive, ran them at nearly 80 miles an hour on track, laid for horse-drawn traffic a generation earlier, and then watched the ground fail before the machines did. Liverpool was the most powerful locomotive in the world, and it lasted 4 years, because the rails could not hold it. Hurricane had 10-foot wheels a decade before that, and lasted barely 1. Cornwall, the strangest of all of them, is still here, rebuilt so thoroughly that the only original parts left are the wheels that made it worth building. Those engineers were not ahead of their time in the way the internet means it. Nothing was taken from them, and nothing was hidden. They were simply working at the edge of what iron and ballast could bear, and they went over that edge repeatedly, on purpose, to find out where it was. The picture was always telling the truth about the machine. It was only ever lying about the year,